Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, fan of lots of things. And I'm trying yet another new series. I keep saying I'm doing these new series. It doesn't mean that I'm replacing the previous stuff that I did. It means I'm adding stuff to it. So I will continue to make videos on lots of different subjects. But one of the things that I said I might do some time ago was field questions about Shakespeare from non-academics. People who just had interesting questions. And I didn't know if anybody would respond, but I actually got quite a lot of questions, more than I can handle in a single video. So I'm going to string a few of these things together. And I figured what I would do is combine a series of hot take responses from me in response to questions, and then also give a little bit more time to consideration of some questions, bringing in a guest who for some reason has some expertise in approaching that particular question. So part of the reason I'm doing this, of course, is to promote Burning Shakespeare, which is my new novel about what happens when somebody tries to wipe Shakespeare from history. It's a comic, time travel, fun thing. Think Good Omens meets The Good Place. I should have thought of that and put it on the book. Anyway, yeah, so I'll put the purchase links for that in there. If you think of other questions that you would like me to tackle in this particular series, then put those in the comments and I'll try to combine them, collate them, and respond to them in the future. Okay, let's see how this goes. So I'm going to start by combining two questions and taking them in a direction slightly different from the one probably intended by the questioner. So Charlie Budgeon asks, what's your approach when reading a Shakespeare play for the first time? Understanding the language, following the plot, etc. That's question one. Question two is from Amber Kinnion, who says, what's your go-to recommendation when trying to get a student into Shakespeare? So these are two different questions, but they're obviously related. They're about that sort of taking that initial step into Shakespeare. And so the first answer I'm going to give is going to be slightly different from what you may have expected, but it's crucially important. So the answer in terms of my own reading or introducing somebody else to it, the first thing you need to do is make sure that they are reading a good text. And that might sound obvious or baffling, depending on how much you know. So, I have, lots of different editions of Shakespeare plays, right? There are tons and tons and tons. And there are reasons for this, right? The reasons are that, Shakespeare was first published in a couple of different ways. I'm not going to go into extensive detail on this, but some of the plays were published in Shakespeare's own lifetime, usually in quarto, which is about this size. Single volume plays that came out in the course of his career. But only half of his works appeared like that. The rest didn't appear until the folio, which is a big, collected works kind of thing, that didn't come out until 1623. Right? So depending on how we count, Shakespeare has, 37, 38 plays, depending on issues of attribution and things like that. But only half of those came out in quarto before the folio came out. The ones that did come out in quarto are different from the plays that were printed in the folio, right? There are three early texts of Hamlet, for example. The first quarto is half the length of the others. The second quarto, which is usually the one that people refer to the most, does not include key passages that only appear in the folio. So part of the thing is it seems like these plays were constantly being modified or rethought or re-edited for certain performance venues or whatever. So that the process of putting the text in print as a sort of solid object is something of a historical accident. So every Shakespeare play is going to exist in multiple different editions. And that's partly because many of the plays have complicated textual histories. So editors have made different choices over the years where there have been more than one authoritative early text. But it's also, Shakespeare is a money-making industry and people constantly generate new editions. The other thing, of course, is that books don't remain in copyright forever. After 75 years, depending on where you are, after a certain period of time, 75 years, 100 years, the text falls out of copyright and can no longer be protected. So one of the things that happens is that things like Shakespeare will get reprinted based on old texts. So if you go into a Barnes & Noble or something and pick up a complete Shakespeare, and you look at it and it looks nice and new and shiny and it's got a nice leather cover or something, and it's cheap. And then you look inside and sometimes you will see copyright 1924 or 1875 or something, right? Because what they've done is they've taken a text for which they do not have to pay, slapped a new cover on it and reissued it. What's wrong with that? Well, it means that the text shows nothing that we have learned in the last 100 years about how texts are edited and how they're best put together for clarity and accuracy, right? It also means that there are either no footnotes at all, or there are footnotes written basically for Victorian people whose interests were different from ours, and you may not even understand the footnotes, right? And you'll also find that often with these texts, changes have been made to the text silently. They've taken out all the naughty words from Romeo and Juliet, for example, or they have added bits from other things that happen to be fashionable in the period, right? This is not how we do textual editing anymore, right? But in these early texts, they did. And so when you buy a cheap edition, a Dover Thrift edition, for example, or one of these sort of combined things that often look quite nice, but are the actual textual editing is very old. These things are, I would say, useless. Do not use them. Do not read them. Likewise, most of the complete texts that you can find online for free are useless, right? They're full of mistakes. They have been uploaded. They may have a purpose for quick search for a quote or something, but if you're going to sit down and read a play, you need a decent text. I would also strongly recommend, this is just me being an old fart maybe, but don't read it on your phone. I have students who insist on reading things on their phone, and every time they read Shakespeare aloud on their phone, they're stumbling, they're struggling, because the screen isn't big enough for them to be able to see the whole line. The formatting messes up the line. So electronic copies of Shakespeare are often tricky because, your eye can tell you the difference between verse and prose when you're reading it on the page. But on a computer screen, especially on a tablet or a phone, that formatting will often get scrambled. And, because these things are not designed to suit play scripts, right, which is what you're reading. So character names and stage directions, speech prefixes, and the actual lines will get messed up. So I would advise you not to use electronic copies if you can avoid it, unless you know that the electronic copy you're working from is really good. Okay? So what should you be reading? Well, as with all things, you kind of get what you pay for to a certain extent, right? There are, I would say, really perfectly good cheap editions. This is a Signet Classic. The Folger series also. And these, in the US are about what? This is priced at the moment at $3.95, but I suspect this is old. You probably get this for $5 or $6, $7, right? Likewise, the Folger editions. If you spend a little bit more, you get things like the Cambridge New Shakespeare, the New Cambridge Shakespeare series, and if you want to, or the Oxford. or the Arden. The Ardens are the most, are the fullest. I'll talk about what they provide in a second. So the different editions that you can buy will do different things. Now, something like this, the Signet Classic Edition, and they have a decent text, decent footnotes, decent introduction, which will give you a sense of the play's history, its performance history, when it was written, and things like that. Perfectly good, serviceable text, and not too cluttered, right? But it'll help you make sure that what you're reading is solid and reliable and hasn't been unduly messed with. I mean, different editions are going to make different choices. You will always find some differences from one edition to the next. But those will be matters of editorial choice and argument rather than incompetence. Okay? So that's what I would say. So at the lower end, Folger, Signet Classic, perfectly good texts. If you want something like a New Cambridge, which puts a little bit more emphasis on performance history, for example, that's a solid text. The RSC edition also focuses on performance. And you might consider something like the Bedford. The Bedford edition, likewise a solid text. They're based on David Bevington's editions. And then they surround the text with documents and discussion from the original period. It's very much a historicist approach to contextualizing key issues and debates within the play. So if you're particularly interested in the historical moment which produced the play, then the Bedford edition series is a good one. Of the traditional scholarly volumes, the Arden series is the most weighty. This is the one that will have, half a page of text and half a page of notes. So this is by far the most thorough in terms of helping you understand, all the different decisions being made by textual editors and things like that, helping you to gloss the text as you read it. Most readers are not going to need an Arden, but if you're doing serious scholarly work or writing a paper on it in college or something like that, the Arden is tough to beat. We're on the third. The third series is out now. They've been doing this for like 100 years, and they will redo them every, in this case, 25 years, as scholarship changes, and the things that we're interested in changes. We're working on the Arden 4 series now, and I'm doing the Julius Caesar, which won't be out for a few years. Why do you need footnotes? Because, and this is to come back to the questions, right? As Charlie's question says, what do you focus on first when you read? Well, when you read first, what you want is to understand what is going on. Now, I know that some people, especially in high schools, like to use No Fear Shakespeare and other texts that have parallel translations. I understand the appeal of this, particularly if you're struggling with the language, but translation of Shakespeare to me is a weird thing, right? Because the original is in English. It's in modern English. Some of the words might be difficult. Some of the phrasing might be obscure. You might struggle with it. But it is modern English. And it is readable. You can usually sort of decipher it. You may need some clues, which is why I recommend an edition that has good footnotes that will help you make sense out of things. I would much rather you did that than rely on a parallel text translation. Because the truth is, you're going to read the translation. You're going to over-rely on that translation. And the translation is one person's rough approximation of what the main text is saying put into modern prose. And that means that you're losing all the ambiguity, all the complexity, all the alternate possibilities that are in the original. And in the end, right, if you're reading Shakespeare, you need to be reading Shakespeare, not somebody's translation of Shakespeare, because what makes Shakespeare Shakespeare is the words. It's not the plots. It's not the stories, right? Most of which he's getting from somewhere else. It's his particular telling of the story in the language spoken by the characters. That's what we need. So I would avoid the parallel text translations because I think people get overly reliant on them and they're not really reading the text and they therefore miss all kinds of stuff. And they believe it's like saying, well, instead of reading this Shakespeare play, I watched the movie. Students say this to me all the time. I watched the movie, so I understand. It's like, no. You watched a movie, one of dozens representing this particular play, one of millions of possible movies based on this play, and you got one director's vision and one series of cuts and one impression of what this play is about. And now you can't help reading that play except through the lens of the movie that you saw. I'm all for seeing Shakespeare in performance. I think that's the single best thing you can do. But always remember that what you're seeing is somebody's interpretation, somebody's adaptation of the play, right? You should also always, if you see a production, try to see multiple productions, different productions that are going to show you the story in different ways. So the same is true when looking at things like translations. Always go back to the original text where you possibly can. And as I was saying, I would always say read the play twice, right? It might feel daunting, but you can read a Shakespeare play in a couple of hours. You might want to break it up, but you can. And remember first and foremost that this is modern English, right? It's not Old English, that's like Beowulf. It's not Middle English, which is like Chaucer. It's modern English. So you want a text that has good footnotes that will help you navigate it. But what you should be looking for at all times is a clear sense of what is being said. Clarity is by far the most important element, right? You might not need all the nuances. You might not need to get a sense of all the sort of the poetic feel, the inference of certain things or the analogies or whatever. What you need to understand is what is being said. If you read a page of Shakespeare or a scene of Shakespeare and you get to the end of it and you don't know what just happened, you need to go back and read it again, right? Don't think that, we can get all sort of arty and, oh, well, he says the word blood is used. Therefore, that suggests to me blood. Nobody cares. What? No, don't do that. I want to know exactly what's being said in simple English. If you can't paraphrase it to yourself, you don't understand it yet. Go back and look at it again. Okay? So, above all, understand the sentence level utterance, and the rest of the stuff will look after itself, right? And yet, as the question suggests, the next thing is to think about plot, to make sure you understand the story. But if you're understanding what's being said on a sentence level, then you'll understand the story. That will follow necessarily. And if you need to sort of glance occasionally at a summary or a Wikipedia page to make sure you understood the plot, that's okay. At the beginning, right? When you're just trying to make sure you understand what's going on and you're feeling, anxious that maybe you missed something crucial. Sure, go back and look at that. Make sure you understood what was happening in the story. And then and if you miss something, go back and look at it. Say, okay, where did I lose the thread of this? Because one of the things about Shakespeare is that sometimes the language is very digressive, right? Characters will give a long speech about something, and the key element might be in the first line, and the rest, that's the plot point, and the rest is a response to the plot point. So if you miss the plot point at the beginning of the speech, you can be lost from that point on. So you always want to be going back and say, well, make sure I understand what's happening, and make yourself notes if you need to, What's going on in this scene? Who's involved in this? Who's in which faction? Who wants who dead, right? Figure that stuff out. And the rest will look after itself. So this is all, as I say, you should read it at least twice. And if we're in a class, I would say read it twice before the class even begins. And then we will sort of pick through key moments in class. And I will be operating on the assumption that you know the story, you understand the gist of what is going on. And we can now mine key moments for things that the language gives us. To come to Amber's question about what I would recommend for people starting out with Shakespeare, this is a tricky one. As a general rule, I tend to sort of point people towards the middle of Shakespeare's career, which means plays written in the sort of mid to late 1590s through about 1605. What that means is the middle comedies like Twelfth Night and Midsummer Night's Dream, and the early to mid tragedies. I actually think I'm working on Julius Caesar, so I've been living with this play a long time. I actually think Julius Caesar is a great place to start. It's not as sexy as some Shakespeare plays. It's not as it may not feel quite as edgy in terms of some of the modern issues that we're tend to be interested in these days. But there's a clarity of focus in this play which is unique, and it's because Shakespeare knows he's telling a story of a particular historical moment that has massive significance for his own period, right? And so everything revolves around the assassination of Caesar. And the story is very, very clear, and it's about people making the decision to assassinate Caesar and trying to figure out whether this is a good idea or not, the assassination itself, and the aftermath. First, the political aftermath in terms of what's the response of the citizens, and then the military aftermath. But it's very clear, It doesn't tend to sort of wind. It's nowhere near as digressive as, say, Hamlet, which gets bigger and bigger and bigger as the key issues generate more and more sort of internal reflection and things. There's relatively little of that in Julius Caesar, and I think it's a good starting point. And it's a play that continues to be very topical politically, right? Political assassination, and manipulation of audiences, and what happens when the wrong people are in power. It's a pretty compelling story. I would recommend that. Macbeth also, which is a play which grows directly out of Julius Caesar, is also a great tragedy to read, partly because it's comparatively short, and again, it has that sort of fairly tight focus. The language is a little harder, it becomes much more sort of psychologically convoluted, right? The play is more psychologically convoluted, and that affects the language. And so you get a lot of that sort of quite difficult, opaque, tongue-twistery utterance in that play. As far as the comedies are concerned, as I said, Midsummer Night's Dream and Twelfth Night, and the only reason that I hold them a little cautious about something like Midsummer Night's Dream is that people tend to assume that it's a simple play because it's about lovers and fairies, and it's not. It's actually I think it's a very complex play. I think in many ways it's quite a dark play. So it's a play that requires you to take seriously things that you might not initially take seriously. I would add also, since we're talking about this period, I'm talking about spanning comedy and tragedy, I would add Romeo and Juliet. I know people read it a lot in school, and some people like it and some people hate it, but I actually do think it's a great starter text, in terms of wrestling with the way Shakespeare uses language to convey character and substance, So I think those would be my recommendations as starting points. I would, if you're just starting out, especially for non-Brits, I would avoid the history plays, much as I love them, or at least some of them. I would also steer clear of the later plays, the plays that Shakespeare writes at the end of his career, the romances, Cymbeline, Winter's Tale, Pericles, Tempest, to a lesser extent. Tempest is a little simpler, but the language in those plays, I think, is harder. Wonderful though they are, I don't know that they're a great starting point. I would also avoid like the problem plays, Measure for Measure, Troilus and Cressida, All's Well That Ends Well. Again, very difficult in certain key respects. So yeah, I think the middle comedies and the big tragedies. Hamlet obviously is a challenge. Othello has its issues as well, but there is a clarity and straightforwardness to the narrative. Um, um, King Lear is huge and ponderous, and wonderful, but difficult. And again, that's one of those plays where you really need a good edition. So let me leave it at that. I said I would field some questions by myself and then invite in a guest to field something else in a slightly more discursive way. So let's do that. Okay, so one of the questions that I got the other day is from Kai Easthammer, and he asks, or she asks, I don't actually know, any truth that the idea of King Lear was influenced by the trouble surrounding the will of Brian Annesley and his three daughters? And the second part to the question is that he's also asking what we think about the Kurosawa adaptation of Lear, Ran. And so I thought that rather than fielding the question simply myself, I would go to people who know more than I do. And so here we are, Peter Holland, who is who's professor of Shakespeare at the University of Notre Dame, currently on sabbatical, basking in balmy Cambridge, UK. And I'm asking him specifically this because he's also the editor of the upcoming Arden 4 edition of King Lear, which you've been working on for how many years at this point?
Only a couple of years so far, so don't hold your breath. Don't put in the order to Amazon yet. They won't know what you're talking about. Eventually, it will be done. But the Annesley case is fascinating. So here's the story. Brian Annesley was a gentleman pensioner of Queen Elizabeth I, and he had three daughters. He had a son who died young, but he had three daughters, and the oldest daughter, who was married to somebody with the wonderful name of Sir John Wildgoose, was really after getting her hands on the family money. And Annesley was getting on a bit and seemed to be losing his mind. These days, we'd probably think of it as kind of early onset dementia or something of that nature. And the middle daughter didn't seem to have got involved in this at all. But the youngest daughter did, and she wanted to defend her father. And in the end, she appealed to Cecil, the great statesman of Queen Elizabeth, to say that her father didn't deserve this. And she wanted to protect her father from the awful idea that he was going to be declared lunatic. That was the term. And the only way she would assent to it would be if he was put in the charge of somebody who was a friend of hers, friend of the family's, who wasn't going to ill-treat him. And she was successful in that. Guess what? When he died the following year in 1604, the will left most of the money to the good daughter. And she put up a very moving plaque in the church after he died, talking about her care for him and being a dutiful daughter. What is so wonderful, and the reason why it's such a resonant event, is the youngest daughter's name. She was Cordelia, and sometimes appears in documents as Cordelia and sometimes as Cordell. Well, it's just another spelling, the same name. So the good youngest daughter was Cordelia. Did that resonate with Shakespeare? Well, given that he died in 1604, Annesley, and around that time, Shakespeare is probably beginning to think of writing King Lear, which appears properly in, the first performance we know about is in 1606. We don't know quite when he was writing. Yeah, it's not improbable. Not improbable that it made him think about it. And of course, that's not the whole plot. Shakespeare was very reliant on an earlier play called King Lear, but spelt L-E-I-R, what we often call King Lear the Unpronounceable, because you can't say it in any way that distinguishes it from Shakespeare's play. And That play had never been printed, but did appear in print in 1605. Or did it appear in print somehow spurred by the Annesley case? Did it appear in print because Shakespeare was known to be writing his King Lear, or perhaps his King Lear was already being performed when that play appeared? We don't know, because there's just too much vague around there. But there's some kind of link. And I can't believe that Shakespeare, given the frequency with which he turned up at court with his company to perform for Elizabeth, or then for King James, when they became the King's Men, that he hadn't come across the story. That doesn't seem to me to be likely. Does it make him think, oh, I think I'll write a King Lear play? I doubt that. Does it be too much of a coincidence for him not to be thinking about it? Yeah, it must have affected him a bit. I think your questioner is right. It's a bit of influence.
Right.
But I can't see it in detail in the play, except for one moment. There is a moment where there's a line about if the wild geese fly that way. And is that a reference to Sir John Wildgoose and his wife? Could be. Could be. That's an in-joke.
Yeah. And of course, the Lear story was known not just from the other play, right? It was known from quasi-historical records,
absolutely, from chronicles like Holinshed and so on. I mean, it was a well-known story. Spencer uses it. It's in Mirror of Magistrates. You know, it's all over the place. There are dozens and dozens because of examples of references to Lear before Shakespeare, because Lear was thought of as a historical king of Britain,
right?
Not king of England, king of Britain. And Shakespeare's King Lear is one of the plays he writes suddenly after King James comes to the throne and is interested in creating something called Great Britain. That's King James's project. Shakespeare stops writing English histories and starts to write British plays like Lear and plays like Cymbeline, that suddenly there's this possibility of a British concern.
Maybe even Macbeth, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's Scottish, which of course is really rather different, but
has an English
looking across into
right?
To a different notion of nation, and all of that is part of it.
Yeah. I mean, we have the prospect of an English army coming into Scotland at the end. Exactly,
to save Scotland, instead of what had actually just happened, which was a Scottish king arrived in England and took over. It's a reverse invasion, if you like, and an invasion essentially of one person.
And in the Holinshed's version of the play, it's a Cordelia, right? The name is still Cordelia.
Yes, I mean it's Cordelia. It's not quite Cordelia. It's different spellings of the same name. Slight changes in pronunciation, but still the same. And the one crucial thing, and it's there in the Annesley story as well, of course, Shakespeare apart, and one or two other examples, Cordelia survives. Lear survives. Cordelia succeeds Lear, and in Holinshed's narrative, Cordelia is then there's a civil war, and she's imprisoned by her sisters, and is hanged there. She hangs herself in despair. So Shakespeare does something very extraordinary by having Cordelia killed on Edmund's orders, and that extraordinary entry of Lear carrying Cordelia's body at the end must have been for the first audiences a shock, because they must have assumed, okay, Lear may die, but Cordelia is going to survive, because that's the historical record. Mary Edgar in Tate's version in the 1680s, not earlier, but you know, and I think the shock of that entry is something we can't quite recapture.
Talking of recapturing or re-embodying, the other part of the question referred to Run. Wonderful
movie. I mean, Kurosawa makes three great Shakespeare movies. He makes Throne of Blood. That's the English title. The Japanese title actually translates as Castle of the Spider's Web. It's a version of Macbeth. It's one of his samurai era movies. It's an astonishing movie. Um, uh, I show it regularly to my students, and they are thrilled by it every time they watch it. Nobody comes back and says, "Why do we have to watch this strange thing in Japanese?" But no, they get it. They're not quite sure about the music, but that's a different question. He makes an adaptation of Hamlet called The Bad Sleep Well, which is set in contemporary corporate Japan, and is good, not quite as good for me as Throne of Blood. And then right late in his career, and Kurosawa's filmmaking career is very, very long, he makes Ran. It's one of the most extraordinary, overused word these days, but epic.
Yeah.
This really is film epic. And it's on an extraordinary scale, and it is so complex, so powerful, so thoughtful. I don't think anybody who sees it will ever forget the final great battle, a horrific battle, where at one point Kurosawa does something that I only know one earlier case of somebody doing this. He cuts out all of the sound of the battlefield, and we just watch it listening to the film score. There is no diegetic sound. And it is desperate, and we're looking at wounded men and appalling acts of cruelty and so on. And he does it by removing the sound of it, because somehow the sound would only interfere with it. And then Lear, called in this Hidetora, comes out of the castle, which is up in flames. And again, it's a shot that is, once you've seen it, you see that image as so powerful. These are moments where a great filmmaker etches something into your memory and you can't ever remove it, and you're very grateful for the experience of having seen that moment.
Well, I'm getting a lot of questions about preferred film adaptations, what people particularly value, and I think I may ask everybody who participates in these videos to sort of throw in also, if somebody said your top 3 Shakespeare films. I realize I'm catching you.
Thank you for that. Okay, I'll do one very obvious adaptation that I just think is fabulous. 10 Things I Hate About You. As often as I watch it, I just think this is a really smart movie. It has oddities around it, but as a way of rethinking Taming of the Shrew,
which we need to do.
which we always need to do, and now especially. I mean, there are other issues in that film. I mean, I have problems with some of what it does, but it makes me smile every time I watch it, and there are great performances. The quirky choice, a version of King Lear that I reckon very few of the people who watch this video will ever have seen, Jean-Luc Godard's version of King Lear. Godard made a version for Goglo, the people who were at that point backing film production, and it is a completely weird, insane movie in which Norman Mailer plays King Lear, but after one day filming, he walks off the set, and Godard includes some of the footage that he shot that day. The theatre director Peter Sellers plays a character called William Shakespeare V, who is trying to recover his ancestors' plays after some kind of nuclear apocalypse. It's wacky beyond belief, but it's also very thoughtful and clever. And I ought to go for something a bit kind of more, if you like, straight. Oh gosh, because I really keep thinking now, because we were talking about it, of Throne of Blood as being so brilliant, but that's a Japanese adaptation and it changes. I want something with Shakespeare's language. Do you know what I'm going to have to go for? For all its faults, Olivier's Henry V.
Interesting.
Closely followed, if I'm allowed to, with the wonderful Warner Brothers Midsummer Night's Dream, 1935. James Cagney's Bottom, introducing a new actress called Olivia de Havilland, who plays Hermia. It's just full of wonderful, wonderful things.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you. I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your enthusiasm, as always.
Thank you. Fun. That was fun.
Okay, so that's it. Thanks. I hope you found this sort of interesting. As I say, I have been building up a number of questions to put a few of these videos together. This is not going to stop me from doing the other kinds of videos that I do, but I will continue to generate a few of these periodically. And if you have questions or comments on this, things that you'd particularly like to see addressed, please put them in the comments. And as ever, like, comment, subscribe, check out my books. Remember, this channel is not monetized, so I don't make anything off it. You can also check out my Patreon page. I'll put all the links in the description. All right, thank you. See you next time.